Now, the BJP has reignited the Katchtheevu debate by accusing the Congress and the DMK of betraying the country. Under what circumstances did India give up its claim to the island? What did it gain in return? Let's hear it from the experts. Joining me right now on the telecast is Mukul Rohatgi. He is the former Attorney General of India. And let's quickly get some answers from him. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Mukul Rohatgi. And of course, my first question to you, under what provisions could Indira Gandhi, the then Prime Minister of the country, have ceded an Indian territory to another country?
See, under the Constitution of India, this would amount to altering the boundaries of India, including boundaries of a state. So, in view of the constitutional provisions, you require an amendment of the Constitution so that the amended boundaries, after you give away something, are then put in place. This requires an elaborate amendment of the Constitution under Article 368, which requires ratification by both houses of the Parliament. Also, it requires consent of the state legislature in respect of which state some boundary is being ceded. So it is not merely an executive act of a government to, have an agreement with a foreign government and say some part of India now belongs to another country. And as far as I understand, my memory, if it is correct, it appears that there was no such procedure which was followed in 1974. And soon thereafter came the emergency, and the whole thing then, kind of went out of focus.
Okay, so to the best of your knowledge, were all constitutional protocols followed in this case?
As I told you, I don't think they were followed. In my answer to your first question, I clearly said it requires an amendment of the Constitution because the boundaries will change. And therefore, it requires a nod of Parliament, which wasn't there.
Right. Now, what territorial and economic zone issues did this create impacting our fishermen today?
Oh, well, it will create a lot of practical difficulties. It is, in fact, creating practical difficulties. You see, the distance between the tip of India and Sri Lanka is not more than 60, 70 or 80 kilometers. And this particular island lies at our door. It's only about 25, 30 kilometers from, the edge of India. Therefore, apart from the fact that it is very critical, because it's at our doorstep near Rameshwaram, there are issues of economic maritime zones, which every country has got the right to fish in waters and other things, or to look for minerals or oil or other things in economic zones. Now, this being, ceded to Sri Lanka, we will not have traditional fishing rights also around this area. And I find, from whatever I have seen, that our fishermen are, regularly being taken captive and stopped by the Sri Lankan Navy in this behalf, and therefore we are pretty much at a disadvantage in respect of all this.
Now, can the ceding of our territory be reversed by any way?
See, reversal can only happen on a bilateral negotiated basis between two sovereign nations. As I said earlier in another interview, some cases and litigation is pending in the Supreme Court in this behalf. But the point is, whatever our court may say, it applies to, India. The judgment of the court in India does not extend extraterritorially to another country. So basically, as far as I see, it can only be a negotiated settlement by sitting across with Sri Lanka, and maybe some give and take, some barter, that we can get our land back. And maybe in lieu, we can give some rights to them. But then that would be a part, I think, only of diplomacy.
Now, can the current government take action to get back the ceded territory?
As I told you, the action can only be as a measure of diplomacy between two sovereign nations. By sitting across the table and telling them that what happened in 1974 was not valid, was not legal, in accordance with the laws of India, and it has created a great kind of a deficit for India. It was not okay. So let's try and have a look at it again, and maybe you give us our island back and we give you some rights, some other rights, etc. So it can only be a negotiated settlement, as I said.
What is your opinion, sir, when the current government raises this issue now, when elections are on the anvil, and could action not have been taken earlier by the government in the course of its 10 years of leadership?
See, that I can't answer. It depends on how and why it is raised, but it is certainly an important issue. So I'm not wanting to cast any blame on one or the other, but the fact remains that if land of this country is ceded to another nation, India is entitled to know why it was ceded. What did we get in return? I can understand barters. There have been barters in the past. We had a barter with Pakistan soon after partition. That is logical because you have some enclaves where people of that country are living and some enclaves where Indians which has fallen to India are living in the other part. You can have a barter. So there is a reported judgment of the Supreme Court called the Berubari case, where a barter did happen, and the Supreme Court has a point in that judgment, which is a judgment on a presidential reference made to the Supreme Court by the then President of India. And the Supreme Court clearly said that the barter could only be, after approval by Parliament. It cannot be just by, an agreement between two heads of state, etc. So, it has been raised today or whatever is for the parties to answer why they have raised it, but it is certainly an important question.
Now, according to you, does the Congress's argument hold when it says that the BJP has ceded territory to China in Galwan and is instead pointing fingers at Congress over this entire Katchtheevu row?
I am not an expert on that, but from whatever I have read, I don't think the government of India has ceded anything in Galwan. Galwan was a bitter skirmish, there was a bitter fight, many people from our side died, many people from the other side died. There's no question of ceding any territory. I don't think that's a correct allegation at all.
What in international law allows India to try and settle maritime disputes?
So maritime disputes can be settled, but as I told you, internationally it's not that easy because the International Court of Justice, its judgments cannot be implemented unless both the states agree. It is a consensual jurisdiction. It is not like a jurisdiction of the Indian Supreme Court which binds everybody in India whether you like it or you don't like it. So it can be done, but basically whether it is done under a maritime agreement or whatever it is, the best thing is to sit across the table and hammer out a solution. Call it by whatever name you want, but it has to be a bilateral situation.
Now, what is the difference between territory forcibly being occupied, like in POK, and ceding territory, like the Katchtheevu issue that has now been raised?
See, POK is a historical thing which has happened because in 1948, the Pakistani army was aiding the raiders, as they were called, who swept from the heights into Kashmir and took away a large portion. There was definitely a weak response by the then government to protect its territory, and unfortunately a large part of J&K is now called POK, though it belongs to India. Now, as you have noticed, that happened in 1948. Now we have not been able to get it back because it's now a part of the other country. So that's the historical thing. And I don't think it's very easy for government of India to get it back because I don't think it's possible to have a bilateral discussion on that now. But as far as Galwan is concerned, I repeat, I do not think that the government of India has ceded any territory whatsoever to China. In fact, as I said, we have tension in Galwan in the northeast because of that. And the Chinese and the Indian troops are standing eyeball to eye, looking eyeball to eyeball. But as far as this issue of ceding the island to Sri Lanka is concerned, it appears to me that it was ceded without really much cause. Maybe the then government wanted to have some kind of better relations with Sri Lanka and it thought that this island was completely insignificant. It's only about 200 acres and therefore if you give it away, not much is going to, be felt as a loss to India. I don't know what the reason was, but it seems to me that it was a blunder. It should not have been done without taking the public of this country into confidence. And public of this country in confidence means the confidence of both houses of parliament and the state legislature. This was not done. And therefore, we have lost a part of our territory and especially which sits at our door, being close to Rameshwaram. That's my feeling.
Now, if there is an anomaly that is found in the mechanism which with the ceding of territory was done, who can be held accountable and under what grounds?
Now it's like 50 years down the line. You can hold the then government, the then Congress government to be accountable. But then what will accountability do? All the people who were there, mostly they have passed away. They may not be there, but what is going to fetch us? It's not like, doing a case against somebody to try and recover. If somebody has looted the nation, you try and recover those things. Now, once this has happened, the only way to kind of reverse it is to sit across with the other sovereign government and try and hammer out a solution. That's all.
Thank you, Advocate Mukul Rohatgi, for joining us on the telecast, sharing your views and legal expertise. All right, on that note, I also have with me Harshvardhan Shringla, who is the former Foreign Secretary of India. He joins me right now on the telecast. Thank you so much, Mr. Harshvardhan, for joining me. And my first question to you, what, to your knowledge, was the sovereign status of Katchtheevu at the point of independence back in 1947?
Katchtheevu has, in some senses, always been a point of discussion between India and Sri Lanka. And that time, the Indian dominion of the British, Empire and the Ceylon dominion. And at that time, I think the British, considering the historic and legal evidence available, decided to leave Katchtheevu within India. In other words, they did not agree to transfer Katchtheevu to Sri Lanka. And what are the evidences? One, of course, is the fact that, the Zamindar or the Raja of Ramanathapuram was collecting tax, and those revenue records are available. The second is some court judgment in 1906 or something. In 1913, there was a report by the British Indian government which basically said that Katchtheevu belonged to the Raja of Ramanathapuram and was a part of India. So given all this evidence, I think the British also decided not to transfer Katchtheevu to Ceylon, then Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. And so if you look at it from that perspective, it is surprising that in 1974, the Congress government of, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi took the decision to, actually demarcate Katchtheevu in favor of Sri Lanka. If you look at the fact that Katchtheevu is a mere 12 nautical miles from the Indian coastline, you are really giving a part of your territory to another country, which basically is very in close proximity to your, let's say, littoral space. And there are severe economic and strategic and security concerns that have emerged. I think the fact that the documents that have been released bring out in great detail the sort of implications, of course, one is that the sort of manner in which Katchtheevu was demarcated in favor of Sri Lanka, that is brought out in the minutes of the meeting that was held to brief DMK, leader and patriarch Karunanidhi ji by the then Foreign Secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. And of course, the second issue is in the context, today's context, when you see the enormous amount of, let us say, costs that it has, impacted in terms of the fishermen and those who rely on fishing for a livelihood in our country. And of course, as I said, the strategic space. I can elaborate in more detail, but that's a long answer to your short question.
Why is this island so important for India's maritime and economic zone?
Let's start with the, strategic and security significance. Because, this is an island which is, it's a small island, and various people, including Prime Minister Nehru and Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, have referred to it as a little rock or a small island. The fact of the matter is that it's very close to your, shoreline or coastline, only 12 nautical miles. Second issue is that if you see the papers that have been released as a result of the RTI, and the briefing that the then Foreign Secretary made to Karunanidhi ji, it brings out the fact that there was a risk of some concessions for oil exploration and exploitation being given by the then Sri Lankan government to Chinese interests. And that would have posed, obviously, a serious issue for India. But my question is that if you knew that there were such risks and there were such potentials for a possible third party to get involved close to your shoreline, then why did you demarcate it in favor of Sri Lanka? That was every reason for you to keep it. And if you look at all the records, there was absolutely no reason, as a negotiator, as someone who dealt extensively with Sri Lanka myself, there's absolutely no reason to give Katchtheevu to Sri Lanka. And there is no mitigating factor. People have said all sorts of reasons. They've said that it was to facilitate the return of Indian origin Tamils back to India. We got the Watch Bank. But Indian origin Tamils have been living there for a very long time, working in Sri Lanka in 1947, and subsequently their status was unsure. Many of them wanted to be nationalized citizens in Sri Lanka, where they were living for generations. And our effort was to enable them to be nationalized where they were, as per their wishes and desires. Those who wanted to come back, came back to India. This agreement will not facilitate anything. If you want to come back to India, what is stopping? Sri Lanka is hardly going to stop you coming back. The second thing about the Watch Bank, which is basically west of Sri Lanka and far closer to the Indian shoreline and quite far from the Sri Lankan coastline. I think I've read reports that Watch Bank was handed over as a result of the Katchtheevu. I don't think there's any linkage. Foreign Secretary Kewal Singh's briefing to Karunanidhi makes no reference of Watch Bank. Watch Bank became part of India under the Maritime Agreement concluded in 1976, so 2 years after this Katchtheevu agreement. So I don't think there's a link. On the contrary, what you've done basically is that you've actually compromised the security by having an island or a place, 12 miles away from your shoreline, become the boundary, a maritime boundary between India and Sri Lanka. That means anything beyond that is something that Sri Lanka can legitimately either give out to third parties, concessions or oil exploration, exploitation. If they knew that danger was there and that imminent risk was there in 1974, why did they not keep Katchtheevu with India? Why did they compromise India's security and territorial, in many senses, integrity, by actually demarcating Katchtheevu in favor of Sri Lanka? Even now, I cannot really think of a plausible reason why Mrs. Gandhi did that. And in doing so, I think you have compromised. And to answer your question, both our economic and strategic interests. It's actually a very indefensible act. And I'm so glad, because I've dealt with it since 2011 as the Joint Secretary dealing with the neighborhood. We had many court cases, there were parliament questions. The DMK was very aggressive about this issue. But the fact of the matter is that the truth has to come out, and there is complete transparency in disclosing all of this documentation in the public domain after 50 years of that particular agreement. And what is very clear is that the DMK that has been the most, I would say, vociferous on this issue in Parliament and outside in the legal domain, saying that Katchtheevu should be returned to India and that our fishermen's livelihoods are affected, is the party which acquiesced in this entire agreement. If their founder, if their chairman and their patriarch, Karunanidhi ji, actually, concurred informally, sort of acquiesced in this agreement going through, means that the party and, some of the top people knew all along that DMK was part of that deal. And so it is a double standard to actually agree to Katchtheevu going to Sri Lanka and then today demanding that Katchtheevu be brought back into India and that the fishermen's livelihoods issues are addressed. I think this is an important point that the people of Tamil Nadu, particularly, a lot of people whose livelihoods are affected, needs to take into account and needs to question this. And so I feel that this issue is very pertinent and very timely because, people have to know at the right time. And people have to base their verdict on, such disclosures where decisions taken by those that they've reposed confidence in, whether it is the Congress government of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi or the DMK government of Karunanidhi ji, the current governments and the current parties have to take into account the fact that these were not only wrong decisions, but they have severe implications on the people. And I think there is also an attempt to mislead, which is even worse.
What do the numbers tell us? How many Indian fishermen are now being detained or harassed by the Sri Lankan Coast Guard and the Navy on a yearly basis?
External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar said that in the last 10 years, over 6,000 Indian fishermen had been held in Sri Lankan custody and over 1,000 boats were actually confiscated by Sri Lankan authorities. And recently, one of our fishermen was charged 10 million rupees by a Sri Lankan court, for fishing in these waters. So it is increasingly difficult for our people to earn their livelihood. Katchtheevu is not a question of fishing, where Katchtheevu is. If Katchtheevu was part of India, our exclusive economic zone would have extended much further away. That means we would have had a much greater part of the Pork Bay for our fishermen to fish in. And I think this would have been a satisfactory outcome. And today, I think the sort of tensions that we see between fisher folk, in India and Sri Lanka, between the governments of India and Sri Lanka, this is an unnecessary irritant in the relationship, which could have been avoided had the right decisions been taken in 1974. And I again come back to my same point that had it been Prime Minister Modi in 1974, he would have never taken such a decision because he would have acted in the supreme interest of the people of India and in line with his policy of Bharat First. There's no question of compromising on your national interests when it comes to such negotiations and some so-called give and take. And so I think, there is, if you can see the contrast between the way foreign policy and, decisions were taken at a certain time by the Congress government and today's context where decisions are taken in a very considered manner and in a manner that reflects the will and the best interests of the people of India.
Now, some individuals are now claiming that the Katchtheevu Island was an exchange deal over Vaj Bank, which is on the continental shelf south of Indira Point. Now, do we have any such records to the best of your knowledge?
Respond to this a little earlier when I said that, when the then Foreign Secretary of India, Keval Singh, he was accompanied by a director in the historic division called Basu. They briefed Karunanidhi ji in great detail in Chennai and then Madras. And, spoke to him of all the possible implications of the deal. Why did they want to go ahead with this? What are the imperatives? What are the reasons to go ahead? And they spoke about the fact that there was a danger of the Sri Lankans taking it to the International Court of Justice, Sri Lankans taking it to the UN, Sri Lankans possibly giving oil concessions to Chinese interests close to our maritime boundary, etc., if this issue was not settled. But at no point, I think, to the best of my knowledge, did the Vajj Bank issue come up. Vajj Bank only came up in 1976, 2 years down the line, when an agreement was signed, a maritime boundary was demarcated where Vajj Bank became part of India. And so from that point of view, I don't think Vajj Bank was an issue at all in the negotiations. Keval Singh, Foreign Secretary Keval Singh only refers to, as I said, only economic interests and the concern that Sri Lanka might take this issue internationally. But certainly, I don't think there was any quid pro quo of any other reason. And if there's any other reason, it's not evident to us. Today, people are only extrapolating. People are guessing. People are making certain hypotheses, but it's not borne out by fact.
Now, was it an economic and strategic error in hindsight to cede Katchtheevu?
So I would not use the word cede because it was an agreement to demarcate the boundary. You only cede if it's part of your territory. So officially, until you demarcate the boundary, it's neither yours nor anybody else's. Basically, you're drawing a line, and that line can bring areas within your boundary or within someone else's boundary. So this line was drawn. So Katchtheevu was on the Sri Lankan side. So it was demarcated in favor of Sri Lanka. And I think from that perspective, I think it was clearly a wrong decision. I would call it a historic injustice to the people of India today that Katchtheevu was actually demarcated in favor of Sri Lanka, because many of the problems that we face today in terms of economic livelihood of our fishermen, the irritants that we have in the India-Sri Lanka relationship, and of course the possible strategic implications of having an island so close to your mainland, so close to your coastal, to your coastline, with another country that could well actually farm out that area for oil exploration, other wind energy, many other reasons to third country interests that may not be that may be inhibited, that may have negative intentions and designs. So it has a serious security implication, which I'm sure the government at the time was aware of. They were aware of all these implications, but yet took a decision by calling it a small rock, a little island or whatever. And I think that is today coming out, and this is something that people have to really take a verdict on as to the, I would say, injustice of.
Right. Now, what according to you should be a provision, and is there a possibility to claim the island back?
International, agreements, especially which relate to boundary, are sort of, not very easy to roll back, because it involves possibly you lodge some of these. You not only states ratified, but you also lodge it in the UN and other bodies, so that that demarcation is something that is available internationally. But Dr. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, I think very, very correctly stated yesterday that we could open a dialogue with Sri Lanka on the issue of fishing rights in and around Katchtheevu. And I think that is something that certainly can be explored. And I think the fact is that we have a very good relationship with Sri Lanka. We enjoy, very close fraternal bonds, and we would have to work on that relationship to ensure that there is no adverse impact, on our relationship on account of this, I would say, historic, error on our part. But that does not absolve the, decision makers, the leaders of our country at that time, especially, the Congress government, which was at the helm of power, which took decisions in a very, unilateral and arbitrary manner, for taking a step that today we have to contend with as a clearly wrong decision. And as I said, I mean, historic injustice to the people of our country.
So then, how do we prevent the harassment of our fishermen in this area?
We'll have to, as I said, we have to work with the Sri Lankan side to ensure that there is more access. If as Dr. Jaishankar mentioned, we could get them to, grant greater fishing rights to our fishermen in the waters around Katchtheevu, provide more access to our fishermen. That would be one important step. And of course, we continue to work to ensure that the Pork Bay is looked at as a natural resource for both countries, and that both countries can exploit this resource in a manner that is in their best mutual interests. Sort of a live and let live policy. And I think there has to be more give and take in this regard. And I'm sure this is something that we have been discussing in the past. We'll continue to discuss, and I believe it is not insurmountable. We can, address these issues. There will, of course, be the tensions that we do see, but we have to minimize those tensions and minimize the friction, and maximize the ability to work in cooperation and harmony with fisher folk on the other side. And many steps in that regard are possible.
Thank you, Shringla, for joining us on the telecast, sharing your views and giving us an analysis of what actually happened in 1974 and then in 1976.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.